So what I'm going to do is read you some stories from a book called Craddock Stories. Many of you have heard of Fred Craddock. He was named one of the 10 top living ministers or preachers by Newsweek magazine several years ago. He is one of our own Disciples of Christ ministers, and he is in Cherry Knoll, Georgia. For many years, he has enlightened, delighted, compelled, and most of all, engaged us with his stories. He came from a farm in Tennessee. His days as a student and professor, his role of a husband and father, his pastorates, and many more experiences. He tells us that. Fred is only 5'2", which is my height. And he's now in his 80s. He's still preaching and teaching in the university. But his outlook on life and his wisdom make you think he was a physical giant. I could go on about him. Some of you have heard him speak. I've been privileged to hear him speak. But it's his wisdom and the way he lives his Christianity is what is so great about him. You forget he's 5'2". This is the book. And it has stories of all sorts in it, from those that you really don't want told in your church to those that he has made up all over the places. He has been a preaching professor for years in different colleges and so forth. And I just can't tell you how great he is. So we're just going to listen to some of his stories. And I want you to think, as you listen to these, how that scripture we just read applies. A young woman came to me during her freshman year of college. I was a failure in my class. I wasn't having any dates, and I didn't have as much money as the other students, she said. I was just so lonely and depressed and homesick and not succeeding. One Sunday afternoon, she said, I went to the river near the campus. I had climbed up on the rail and was looking into the dark water below. But for some reason or another, I thought of the line, cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. She said, I stepped back, and here I am. He said to her, where did you learn that from, that line? She said, I don't know. I said, did you go to church? No. Well, when I visited my grandmother in the summer, we went to Sunday school and church sometimes. And he said, This to me means that when we have the little ones in this church, our actions, our words, and our deeds are what they hear and see. Think about it. We are their teachers. They do not have to be our biological children. We are the people to set forth the standard of them living. Then we go to another one. There's a church in Georgia where the chairman of the board proclaimed at an annual meeting that they have keys made and give each family a key to the church. They should otherwise keep it locked because, he said, you do not know who can come into this church. I mean, how are you going to have a church family if you don't make it clear who's not family? No shoes, no shirt, no service. And this is from his first pastorate when he was still a student in college. I remember the first church I served as a student. They had a fund called the Emergency Fund. Seems like that's right. And it had about $100 in it. They told me I could use it at my discretion, provided I dispensed the money according to the conditions. So I said, what are your conditions? The chairman of the committee said, you are not to give the money to anyone who is in need as a result of laziness, drunkenness, or poor management. I said, well, what else is there? Then he says, as far as I know, they still have that $100. told you about the minister when I was preaching in that church in Louisville. He said, now you go down to the choir, and I'll join you up there. I thought he was going to have a prayer at the back of the sanctuary. He disappeared. Later in the service, things were going along, and I was wondering where he was when the window opened. He crawled in through the window. He came up, sat up there through the whole service, and acted like a fairly decent human being. I asked him later, what did you do that for? He said, well, everybody just sits out there so bored, I thought I'd give them a little something extra. After the declaration of war by President Bush, in which we call the Gulf War, some of the Christians in Atlanta had gathered for prayer. We had psalms, we had scripture, we had prayer, and then psalms and scripture and prayer for a long time. They were seated next to me, a young man, I think about 17 or 18, might have been a freshman at the university, I don't know. In the course of the Senate's prayers, he asked that God be with the women and the children in Iraq who would be hurt and killed in the war. When it was over, a man in his mid-50s came over to that young man and said, are you on Saddam's side? He said, no, sir. Well, you're praying for the wrong people, he said. How would you have reacted to that? Would you have stood up? Would you have said something? When I was a kid, I went to church with my mother, and the minister would speak to my mother. How are you, Miss Craddock? And 5 of us kids would go along like little ducks along behind their mother. How are you, Sonny? How are you, honey? How are you, Sonny? How are you, honey? There were 5 of them. But I remember when another minister came to the church, and about his 5th or 6th Sunday, when I went along there, he said, Fred, how are you doing? He was the best minister that ever was at that church, because there's a big difference between being Sonny and being Fred. I preached 4 nights in a row in Atlanta one time, a nice big church with a good crowd, more than I used to. There was a moment in the service when the pastor would say, we'll now have our moments of fellowship. Greet each other in Christian love. And you never saw such hugging and kissing and carrying on in your life. People going across the room and up and down the aisles and grabbing and hugging. Someone came up to me, I was down behind the pulpit, and gave me a big smack. It was just really something. Finally he said, all right, hold it, we have to get on with the worship. 4 nights of this. The last night he and his wife took me and my wife out to coffee. He said, did you ever see such a family church? Did you ever see such love in all your life? My wife said, yes, I have. He said, what do you mean? She said, I was there for all 4 services and no one ever spoke to me. And do you know what he said? He said, well, that's because they didn't know who you were. How in the world are they going to learn who she was? My wife was away some time ago, and I was going to fix one of my big meals. I stopped off at the Winn-Dixie to get a jar of peanut butter. I was in a hurry, and the store was so huge, and who wants to spend the afternoon looking around in the store for peanut butter? So I saw a woman who was pushing a cart in a kind of stroll, and I thought, she's comfortable here, I'll ask her. And I said, lady, could you direct me to the peanut butter? She jerked around and stared at me and said, are you trying to get on me? I said, I'm looking for the peanut butter. And as I backed away from there, I saw a stop voice. I said, where's the peanut butter? Aisle 5, he said, I think. Way down to the left. I went down there, and halfway down to the left were big jars of peanut butter. I took one. As I turned to leave, the woman was there, and she said, you were looking for peanut butter. And I said, I told you I was looking for peanut butter. And she said, well, nowadays you can't be too careful. And I said, lady, yes, you can. You sure can. These stories, I just feel like appeal to all of us. I mean, they're human, and yet they all have just a little bit of God's message in each one of them. I found so many that it was just hard to not stand up and read all of them to you. I was in a church gathering in Ponca City, Oklahoma, and somebody asked me during the question and answer period what I thought about somebody's view of the Bible that had just been published, and they had all read it. I discussed it, and I said, there's a lot of thought there, and I'm sure this is a very sincere person, but his view of the Bible is not adequate for me. I just think he puts too much water in the wine. Afterwards, a woman came up to me and gave me 2 tickets to the state Women's Christian Temperance Union banquet. She wanted my wife and me to go. And I said, why this? And she said, we just don't have enough ministers speaking out against drink, and I appreciate what you said. Now, what did I say, and what did she hear? I was walking one afternoon. I passed a corner where a man was doing something that fascinated me. I stopped my walk and watched him. He had a pile of bricks, and the thing he was doing was measuring each brick. How long it was, how wide it was, how deep it was. He threw a bunch of good-looking bricks out, I thought. He said, I've got to get these all exactly the same size. I said, why? He said, I'm building a church and I want it to stand. See, there are people who think that the way to really have a church is to get people that are from the same economic and social and educational background. And they'll all be together. Boy, he started stacking those bricks. They were all just alike. I went by the next afternoon, and they were all just a pile of bricks. They'd fallen down. I went on around the corner, and I saw a man with a pile of rocks. You've never seen such a mess in your life. No 2 of them alike. Round ones, dark ones, small ones, big ones, and little ones. I think, what in the world are you doing? He said, I'm building a church. I said, you're nuts. The guy down there had all his all alike, and he couldn't make it stand. The second man said, this'll stand. It'll stand. It won't either. Yes, it will. I said, you can't get it to stand. The fellow down there had them all marked. He said, it'll stand. And he went over to a wood tray, took something like a hoe, and began to stir something back and forth. Looked like a lot of cement to me, but that's not what he called it. He put healthy doses of that between the stones. I went back 34 years later, and it was still there. It was the stuff in between. It looked a lot like cement. That's not what he called it. You know what he called it? Building a church. My wife and I finished our service at the student church where I was in seminary. Our last Sunday there, they gave us a gift. It was a quilt some of the women of the church had made, and they stitched into the top of the quilt the names of all the church members. Every time we moved, when we'd come across that quilt, we'd spread it out on our bed, and we'd say, there's Chester, who voted against and persuaded the others to vote against my raise. There's Mary and John, who put new tires on our car. There's Lloyd, very quiet, never said anything. There is his wife, Marie, who became violent one day, yet she was always faithful and pleasant. And he was dying with cancer when we went. My first funeral there, you remember? And this is the way we go over the quilt. Before I married, I served in a little mission in the Appalachians. I moved down to a place on Watts Bear Lake between Chattanooga and Nashville, a little village. It was a custom of the church at